If Belgrade had fallen, Europe would have been lost. Sir Steven Runciman. If you think you know Europe's history, think again. This was more than a siege. It was the day faith and fire held back an empire. Discover the untold battles, the betrayals, and the mysteries the world forgot, only on Unsolved History. Subscribe now and step into the forgotten corners of time. The summer of 1456 burned like no other. Just 3 years had passed since the world had watched in awe as the crescent banner of the Ottomans rose over the walls of Constantinople. Now the same Sultan, Mehmed, barely 24, turned his eyes northward. His ambition was boundless. His cannons had torn down the greatest walls of Christendom, and now the gates to Europe stood open. Hungary, the lonely bulwark between East and West, was all that remained. Belgrade sat on a high bluff where the Danube and Sava rivers met, a fortress so strong that the winds themselves seemed to break against its stone. For centuries, it had been the hinge between two worlds. Whoever held Belgrade held the door to Europe. In Buda, word spread like wildfire. The Sultan was coming with more men, more guns, more ships than anyone had ever seen. Panic whispered through the markets. Priests preached of apocalypse. Yet in the midst of fear stood one name that still carried weight: John Hunyadi, the White Knight of Hungary, veteran of a dozen campaigns against the Turks. Scarred, gray, and hardened, Hunyadi had faced the Ottoman tide before and survived. He knew the threat better than any king or bishop. If Belgrade falls, he warned, the Danube will run red until it reaches Vienna. But the kingdom was divided. The young King Ladislaus was a boy, nobles squabbled over power. Mercenaries demanded pay that no one could afford. Hunyadi could rely only on his own fortune, his veteran retainers, and the faith of common men. South of the border, Mehmed's army moved like a living storm. Over 100,000 soldiers, janissaries drilled to perfection, cavalry archers from Anatolia, heavy cannon dragged by chains of oxen. The Sultan himself rode at the center, silent, unreadable, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Behind him, the banners of conquest rippled in the wind. In the spring of 1456, Hunyadi rode to Belgrade. The fortress was a miracle of stone triple walls, a citadel on high ground, towers bristling with crossbows and bombards. But its garrison numbered barely 5,000 men, veterans, peasants, and monks armed with little more than faith. To strengthen them came an unexpected ally: Giovanni of Capistrano, an aging Franciscan friar whose voice could stir armies. He preached across Hungary and the Balkans, calling farmers, craftsmen, and beggars to take up the cross. "God needs no kings," he cried, "only believers." Tens of thousands answered, an unruly crowd of peasants carrying scythes, axes, and torches, marching under makeshift crosses toward Belgrade. They were not soldiers, but they were countless, and their faith burned hotter than iron. Hunyadi grimaced at the sight. Fanatics and zealots were unpredictable, but he also knew that without numbers, courage would mean nothing. By June, the Ottoman vanguard appeared. Turkish galleys filled the Danube, cutting off supplies. Their cannon crews began to dig earthworks opposite the fortress. Soon the roar of bombardment shook the riverbanks. Day after day, stone shattered and dust rained down. The defenders patched walls at night with timber and prayer. Inside, disease spread. Food grew scarce. Yet each dawn, Capistrano walked the ramparts holding high a wooden cross, shouting in Latin and Hungarian that God watched over them. Even Hunyadi, ever pragmatic, found comfort in the friar's unbroken spirit. By mid-July, the Sultan himself arrived. The Ottoman camp sprawled like a city, rows of tents, forges blazing, drums echoing across the plain. Mehmed studied the fortress through a spyglass. "This," he said quietly, "shall be my second Constantinople." The bombardment began anew, 12 great cannon firing day and night. The earth trembled. Towers cracked, parapets crumbled. Hunyadi's engineers counter-fired from hidden positions, but their guns were too few. The defenders fought on, repairing by torchlight, dragging the wounded from the rubble. On July 21st, the walls finally gave way. With a thunderous shout, the Ottomans surged forward. Janissaries poured through the breach, their scimitars gleaming. The air was thick with smoke, screams, and the clang of iron. For hours battle raged hand-to-hand within the outer city. Then, from the river, came salvation. Hunyadi had secretly built fire ships, old barges filled with pitch and powder. As the Ottoman fleet closed in, he gave the signal. Flames leapt skyward. Turkish ships exploded, smoke rolled across the water, confusion spread through the besiegers. That night, Hunyadi struck back. He led a sortie of knights and infantry through a hidden gate, charging straight into the enemy trenches. Caught off guard, the Ottomans reeled. Capistrano's peasant crusaders followed, shouting prayers that echoed like thunder. Fire and faith swept the plain. By dawn, Mehmed himself joined the fray, rallying his guard. Arrows whistled, cannon thundered at point-blank range. The Sultan was wounded in the thigh, his banner nearly seized. Seeing their master fall, the Ottoman line wavered, and then broke. What began as a desperate defense turned into rout. The mighty army that had conquered Constantinople fled across the Danube, leaving behind their dead, their guns, and their pride. Belgrade still smoldered. The dead lay thick upon the walls. Hunyadi rode through the ruins silent. He had won, but the cost was beyond counting. Thousands of peasants lay where they had fought. Even the friars' robes were torn and blackened. Capistrano, exhausted, murmured only, "God's will be done." 3 weeks later, plague swept through the camp. John Hunyadi, the savior of Belgrade, caught the sickness and died. He did not live to see how far his victory would echo. When news reached Rome, bells rang across Christendom. Pope Calixtus III ordered the noon bells to be rung in every church to honor the victory, a tradition that still lives today. Across Europe, people whispered that Hungary had saved the West. Mehmed retreated, humiliated but unbroken. He would fight again, conquer again, and die an old man. Yet he never forgot Belgrade, the fortress that stopped him. For decades, the Ottomans avoided the city, as though its walls were guarded by angels. History moved on, kings rose and fell, borders changed. But in that summer of 1456, the fate of a continent turned on courage, faith, and a single fortress at the meeting of two rivers. Belgrade stood because a wary knight refused to yield, because peasants believed their souls could hold back an empire, because one nation dared to defy the inevitable. Centuries later, historians still marvel. Some call it miracle, others madness. But all agree had Belgrade fallen, the map of Europe would look very different. So remember the summer when thunder rolled over the Danube, when Hungary stopped the Sultan. Discover the battles, betrayal, and the mysteries the world forgot. The roar of cannons had become the heartbeat of Belgrade. Day after day, the sky burned with fire and smoke as Ottoman artillery thundered against the city's ancient walls. The Danube, once a river of life and trade, had turned into a graveyard of splintered ships and drifting bodies. And yet, inside the fortress, the defenders did not break. John Hunyadi walked the ramparts as a man possessed. His armor was dented, his face streaked with soot and blood, but his eyes burned with purpose. Each explosion shook the ground beneath him, yet he moved like a storm contained within flesh. He knew what was at stake. If Belgrade fell, there would be nothing left to stop Mehmed's empire from sweeping across Europe. From his command tent across the river, Sultan Mehmed II, the Conqueror of Constantinople, watched the siege unfold with cold intensity. He had crushed empires and humbled kings. He believed destiny itself marched at his command. But this siege was unlike anything he had faced before. Belgrade, small and battered though it was, refused to die. The Ottoman guns had reduced towers to rubble, gates to ash, yet the Hungarian banners still waved defiantly above the ramparts. Every night, the defenders rebuilt what was destroyed. Every morning, they fired back with whatever cannons they could salvage. Priests carried crosses through the streets, blessing men who had not eaten in days. Farmers, students, and monks fought shoulder to shoulder with knights and mercenaries. And then came July 21st, 1456. The Sultan ordered a full assault. The sky went black with arrows. Ottoman drums thundered like the beating of 1,000 hearts. From every direction, waves of janissaries, speys, and siege troops surged toward the city walls. The defenders responded with boiling oil, flaming pitch, and crossbows that never seemed to stop firing. The noise was beyond human description, a storm of screams, metal, and fire. On the southern wall, a massive explosion tore through a section of the fortifications. Mehmed's elite troops poured into the breach, slaughtering everything in their path. For a moment, the city trembled, and it seemed Belgrade would fall. But from the dust and chaos emerged John Hunyadi himself. He charged into the breach, sword drawn, shouting words that would echo through history. Around him, men rallied. Farmers dropped their tools and picked up fallen spears. Monks wielded torches like weapons. Hunyadi fought not as a nobleman, but as a warrior born of the soil. He struck down enemy after enemy, his armor glinting red under the firelight. For hours, the battle raged in close quarters. Streets turned into rivers of blood. The walls were slick with it. Yet, slowly, impossibly, the defenders pushed the Ottomans back out of the city. When night fell, Belgrade still stood. But Hunyadi knew this was not victory, not yet. The Sultan's army was still vast, and the next attack could come at dawn. Then came something no one expected. As dawn approached, Father Giovanni of Capistrano, the old friar who had inspired peasants to join the defense, climbed onto a broken tower and raised his cross. With a voice that carried through smoke and chaos, he cried out, "Now, men of Christ, now we strike for all that is holy." The exhausted defenders, hearing his voice, surged again, not to defend, but to attack. What followed defied all logic. Without orders, a band of peasants stormed out of the gates and threw themselves at the Ottoman trenches. Hunyadi, realizing the opportunity, gathered what remained of his forces and led a full-scale counterattack. The Hungarian banners once again rose above the smoke, and the defenders charged into the enemy camp. The Ottomans, caught off guard, reeled under the assault. Fires spread through their lines, supply wagons exploded, horses panicked. Even Mehmed himself was wounded by a defender's arrow that grazed his thigh. For the first time, the invincible army of the Sultan faltered. Hunyadi's men pressed the attack with everything they had. The roar of their charge echoed across the Danube like the voice of vengeance itself. Hours later, when the sun finally broke through the clouds, the impossible had happened. The Ottoman army was in retreat. The defenders stood atop their shattered walls, watching as the greatest army in the world fled across the plains. Belgrade had held. Europe had been saved. The cost was terrible. Tens of thousands lay dead, and Hunyadi himself would not live long after the victory, succumbing to the plague that swept through the city in the aftermath. Yet his name would live forever. When news of the victory reached Rome, the bells of every church in Christendom rang for 3 days straight. Even today, they say the tradition of the noon bell, the ringing of church bells at midday, was born from that victory, ordered by the Pope to honor the defenders of Belgrade. And as for the Sultan, Mehmed would return to fight many more battles, to conquer new lands, to build his empire. But never again would he take Belgrade. The fortress that had defied him once would stand as a symbol of defiance for centuries to come. In the quiet after the storm, Father Giovanni wrote of the siege, "Men fought not for glory, nor for kings, but for the light that was fading. And in their stand, they kept that light alive." The Siege of Belgrade became legend, a moment when ordinary men rose against impossible odds, when courage, faith, and unity held back the tide of empire. It was the day Hungary stopped the Sultan. History remembers the conquerors, but never forget those who refused to be conquered. If Belgrade had fallen, Europe would have changed forever. These are the stories buried beneath centuries of dust. The battles, the betrayal, the mysteries the world forgot. To uncover them, subscribe to Unsolved History, where every forgotten war still echoes, waiting to be heard.